Okay, well, good evening. It's 6:30, so welcome along to tonight's Rushcliffe Borough Council Planning Committee meeting. For our guests in the audience there, I'm Councillor Richard Butler. I'm the chairman of the committee. To my left is Councillor Mrs Stockwood, who is my vice chairman. To her left is Mrs Soul, who is the borough solicitor. And to my right is Mr Pegram, who is the service manager for communities. So we'll go into, and the rest of colleagues here are members of the committee. So we'll go into the agenda. Do we have any apologies for absence and substitute members, please?
Apologies from Councillors Healy, Murray and Major. Substitutes are Councillors Hetherington, Walker and Jones.
Thank you very much. I think because we've got members of the public here, we better just do a quick little escape guide, health and safety.
Yes, Chairman, I'm not expecting the alarm to sound this evening, so if the fire alarm does go off, we have to vacate the chamber. Two ways, either through the 3 sets of double doors at the back, turn left, out of the side door of the building, and we congregate in the rear corner of the car park, far left-hand side. If that route's not available to us, out the side doors and through the front onto the far end of the concourse here at the front. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Otherwise, just follow us as we run out. So, do we have any declarations of interest under the Code of Conduct and or under the Planning Code, please? Can you put your microphone on? Because I can't.
I'm on the Trent Valley Internal Drainage Board. I'm told by other councillors that I am.
Well, you only need to are you declaring that as an interest in any of the items on the agenda? No. No, I don't think you need to. No, you only really need to declare an interest on this committee if, for example, you're a neighbour of an application or you know the applicant, anything like that. But because you're on another board representing the council in another guise, you wouldn't need to.
I'm only saying that because they said they did it at Newark. So.
Well, they may do it at Newark, but we don't. But anyways, but you're right to be on. It's best to be on the cautious side. So no worries there. Oh, can you turn your microphone off again, please? Thank you. So no declarations of interest. So minutes of the previous meeting held on the 18th of July. For those of us who are here, are we happy that they are accurate and correct? Sure, yes, happy with that, so I'll sign them. It's the 15th, isn't it? Yes. It is. And a long meeting that was as well.
It's the Feast of the Assumption today.
Right, so we'll now go into the main items on the agenda, which are planning applications to be discussed and decided. The first one tonight is 1 Stamford Road, West Bridgford, erection of 1 detached dwelling. This is a revised proposal and it's part retrospective. Mr Pegram, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, the application, first one on the agenda tonight, relates to a plot adjacent to 1 Stamford Road. You can see here you've got Melton Road, Stamford Road, and then Parkcroft Road, and the plot sits here, previously part of the garden area to number 1. That shows you the aerial photograph, just again confirming location of the site in relation to those 3 roads that I mentioned. Chairman, you probably picked up from the agenda that there is already a structure on this site. Planning permission was granted for a dwelling in April 2015. Following the construction or the commencement of the construction of that dwelling, there were some concerns raised by residents about what was being built on site, and that was the subject of investigations by your planning officers. It was found that the development did not comply with the approved planning permission that was granted, and therefore we've taken the view that the structure is wholly, not as it's spelt in the agenda though, Chairman, is wholly unauthorised. Members should, to some extent, ignore the fact that there is a structure on site. Members are being asked to consider an application this evening for a dwelling on the site. That application must be considered on its merits, and to a certain extent ignoring the fact that that has been built pursuant to the previous application, although not in accordance with the approved plans. So you can see here is Stamford Road. Just Stamford Road is in the picture. The application site is behind this wall here. You can see the part constructed structure there. Property to the left of that picture is number 149 Melton Road. If we then move along, again you see more of 149 here and their garage with access from Stamford Road. Moving to the other side of the application site, looking back, you can now see again the structure that's constructed here, front boundary to the site with opening for an access. And that's stepping right back now past Parkcroft Road, looking back towards the application site, which is roughly where I'm indicating by the laser pointer. Number 1 Stamford Road here, and then obviously the property is on the south side of Stamford Road, picking up those details as well. That's looking down the road, Parkcroft Road. No, sorry, Chairman, this is stood at the junction of Parkcroft Road, looking along Stamford Road. So again, that white van marks the position of the site roughly. Parkcroft Road is off to the right here. That's now looking down Parkcroft Road. So this is the corner of property 1 Stamford Road on the corner. And then just moving a bit further, or another picture, slight different angle, again showing the gable end of number 1 with Parkcroft Road in front of you here. Now we're looking at the properties on the opposite side of the road. So that's 2 and 2A and 2B creeping into the picture here. So these are opposite the application site. Now we move into and around the back of the site. So this is taken from the garden of 1 Stamford Road, looking across at the rear of the building across the site. This is actually a temporary fence, Chairman, that's been erected here. You can see in the foreground. A bit closer look at that's the, as I say, temporary fence to subdivide the 2 areas at the moment. And then looking in a generally northerly direction at the gable end of number 30 Parkcroft Road. Now into the application site. So this is the side wall of number 1. This is the side wall of the structure that's been constructed on the site, looking forward towards Stamford Road there. And then turning round now within the back of the plot, looking across the back boundary towards the properties on Parkcroft Road. That's now looking towards number 149 Melton Road, so it's looking in a generally westerly direction. And again, just moving closer to show you the relationship between the 2 buildings there. That's obviously looking at the front garden, looking out of the site, 2A and 2B across the road, front boundary wall. You'll note there are 2 trees on the frontage of this site. One of those is a protected tree now, not this one. This one has suffered some fire damage and has disease, and your tree and landscape officer didn't consider it to be worthy of protection because of its health issues. The other one, which you'll see in the photographs, is the subject of a tree preservation order. And then we're now in the garden of 30 Parkcroft Road, looking towards the back of number 1 Stamford Road and the application site. Slightly different angle, picking up the rear boundary of that property and the application site beyond. And then a picture from within inside that property, looking towards the application site. I believe this is a kitchen window. And then standing within the conservatory, again looking towards the application site. If we then move over to the garden, Chairman, sorry, I should say a couple of pictures from the first floor of number 30 Parkcroft Road. And we're now in the garden of number 147 Melton Road, looking again towards the application site across the rear garden of number 149. And then turning slightly to the left to look at the back of 30 Parkcroft Road. So again, the application site is behind this hedge. So, Chairman, what this plan shows you is the original approval, the footprint of the original approval that was granted in 2015. And you can see that what's been constructed on site in the grey colour does not resemble that footprint. The building is also wrongly positioned on the site, although I understand, having had discussions with the applicants and their architects, part of the reason for this is that the original site plan was based on an Ordnance Survey extract. So the site was drawn up on an Ordnance Survey extract, but then when it was set out on site, it gives a different position because, in fact, the boundaries are not in the same position as the Ordnance Survey suggests. The plans that accompany this application have been produced as a result of a topographical survey and are therefore more accurate in terms of position, alignment, etc. So you can see the difference there. That's the protected tree, and this is the tree on the other side, which is not protected. These are the proposed floor plans. So ground floor plan, there's a basement included, and then bedrooms at first floor and second floor within the roof space. Just looking a bit closer, this was submitted more to pick up the details of the driveway. The driveway layout and construction has been changed through negotiations to have a minimal impact on this tree or reduce the impact on this tree. As I say, this one, if it were to be lost, your tree and landscape officer is not too concerned because it has got disease. These are the proposed elevations of the building. So you have a street scene showing you what the building would potentially look like in that street scene, the two trees, and then front elevation. That's the elevation facing 1 Stamford Road, rear elevation, and then the side elevation towards number 149 Melton Road. You do have at the bottom there a section which shows a basement construction and the levels through the building. And the final plan, Chairman, shows you what has been constructed on site compared to what is proposed. So you can see the dark lines are what's been constructed on site. So the front doesn't have significant changes so much. At the rear, the building has not yet reached, if it were to continue with the construction that's on site, the building has not yet reached wall plate level for the roof. So that line there is representative of the sill level of the first floor window on the building or the structure that's currently on site. The alterations would reduce the floor levels within those rooms and bring the sill level down to what you can see there. This one, if I go to the side elevation, it's probably best to explain this. On the back of the structure that's constructed on site, there is a single story element. Part of the issue with the raising of the ground floor levels is because of the inclusion of a basement within the building. And the proposal at the back here is to demolish this single story element, reconstruct it at a lower level, bringing the floor level down to closer to ground level, and that would introduce some steps within the accommodation, and then with a lean-to roof. The reason that your officers have negotiated those changes, Chairman, is because of the elevated nature of what has been constructed on site. It means that the windows and the floor levels are higher within the building, which gives a greater potential for overlooking of neighbouring properties. It's considered that the changes that have been negotiated and the reduction in the levels and the window sill levels would reduce that overlooking, and that the proposal would not now result in unacceptable overlooking of neighbouring properties. Just in general terms, Chairman, I did say you must consider this application on the basis of what's before you, not what's gone on before. In general policy terms, the site is clearly within West Bridgford. It's in a highly sustainable, built-up area. The principle of residential development is considered to be acceptable. So the issues then which are of greatest relevance are the size, scale, mass, appearance of the building, the design of that building and its impact on the amenities of the area, and obviously impact on neighbouring properties and highway considerations. Those issues have been looked at very carefully by your officers, Chairman, and the application has been brought before you with a recommendation to grant planning permission. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pegram. Now, we have two public speakers for this item. I've got Mr. Machin, who is the agent for the applicant. Is Mr. Machin here? So if you'd like to come to this table just here, please. And the way it works, you have up to 5 minutes to talk to us. It's not a discussion, it's a one-way presentation. As soon as you're ready, press the right-hand button on the microphone, the red light will come on and the timer will count down. If you're still talking when it comes to zero, I have to stop you. So as soon as you're ready.
Thank you. Chair and members, I support the recommendation of the Council's planning officers to grant planning permission. This positive endorsement from your planning team is a result of detailed discussions between the Council, the applicant Mr Singh and project architect over the last 9 months. The proposed set of planning conditions within your officer's report are agreed such that this grant of planning permission would ensure that Mr Singh and the Council can finally move on. To begin with, I wish to acknowledge this desperately unfortunate situation which has resulted in a half-finished house in a highly visible location. A liability claim against the builder is progressing, but of course the responsibility is left with the applicant and landowner Mr Singh to put things right and as soon as possible. This leads me to this application on which hopefully a positive decision can be made this evening by members. The new house being proposed is actually only slightly different to the house that was originally granted planning permission. The new house proposed is in fact lower, both in terms of ridge height and eaves height, than the previously approved dwelling, as stated in paragraph 10 of the committee report. A full schedule of works to be undertaken to the existing building to make it compliant with the submitted drawings has already been submitted to and agreed with the planning officers. The new dwelling will also boast rainwater harvesting systems, the reuse of grey water for washing and utility purposes, and will continue to be built using the latest construction method of insulated concrete formwork, resulting in low running costs, high levels of air tightness, insulation levels and a mechanical ventilation heat recovery system. We note that some local people have objected to this application. However, we consider these objections on the basis of the length of time the development seems to be taking and the unfinished appearance of the site, rather than the principle of a dwelling in this location or its proposed design. The views of the Council's planning officers is that the design, appearance and materials proposed are such that the new dwelling would not be out of character with the street seen at this part of Stamford Road, as stated in paragraph 43 of the report. Paragraph 47 confirms that the proposal would not result in significant or unacceptable overlooking of adjacent properties or raise any other amenity issues. Paragraph 49 confirms the garden of the new dwelling will be comparable to 30 Parkcroft Road or 1 Stamford Road. The Highway Authority do not object to this application, and the Council's landscape officer does not object but has requested that the existing 2 trees on site are protected during construction. No dig construction methods will be used around the trees themselves to protect the existing roots. In conclusion, negotiations have taken place during the life of this application to address any possible adverse impacts identified by both officers and any members of the general public. Amendments have been made to the proposal addressing these adverse impacts, thereby resulting in a more acceptable scheme that has now been positively endorsed and supported by your planning team. I therefore hope that members can support the planning officer's recommendation and grant planning permission for this development, subject to the 11 planning conditions set out at the end of your committee report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Machin. That's well within the 5 minutes, so thank you very much for that. And our next speaker is one of the local ward members, Councillor Goland, please. And you've also got up to the 5 minutes to talk to us.
So fundamentally, I'm completely in favour of infill building, particularly in West Bridgford. It's going to lead to sustainable, affordable and high quality housing for people. So that's a good thing, and I'm really happy to hear about the environmental mitigation scheme on this house. The reason I'm here really is to support a number of the local residents who are not happy with this. The new plan is bigger. It's got it's got a larger footprint. It is overbearing really on the houses on Melton Road. You can see how close it is on that plan, And you can see how big it is and how much space on the land is actually filled up with housing now with the building there. I have to say, my feeling is in terms of the road design, it's in the wrong place in that plot. Clearly, that plot is big enough to support 2 houses. So my first concern is it's just very large, the footprint. And then the other problem I have really is the trees. I mean, the tree now has got a tree protection order. Can you move the slides? Can I move the slides? Thanks. The tree has got a tree protection order on it. The original form said, and I think the current form still says there's no trees on the site, which is clearly not the case. But basically, obviously, we've now got a house here. It's caused a lot of upset to local people. The house is half built and something needs to be done, but it does feel really it's an imposition on the local residents to have this very large footprint house in this space. That's it. Thank you.
I'm still writing my notes here, so thank you very much for that. Right, so we heard from Mr. Machin, who was explaining the background and the regret about the situation we're in now, but we wanted to move forward in a positive way. Oh, sorry, yes, the microphone's still on. And we heard about the environmental improvements and systems planned, the fact that they consider it in keeping with the area, and a lot of negotiation has gone on, and there's some tree protections in place. And Councillor Goland, who's speaking on behalf of residents and neighbours who are concerned about the larger footprint, feels it's the wrong place for the type of design, and worried about other trees. So I think that's covered most of the points. Do you want to pick up on any of those, please?
No, Chairman, I think they're all covered in the report. The only thing I did neglect to refer to at the beginning, there is a late representation who you've all received. In addition to that, Chairman, just as a late update, one of the concerns raised by residents is, I think, and it was referred to by the ward councillor, is the fact that this has been going on for a long time. And I think even if members are minded to approve the application tonight, they're still concerned that nothing will happen. 2 factors there, Chairman. One is I'd like to recommend an additional condition. As I say, what's on site is wholly unauthorised. So arguably, no development has yet commenced in terms of what you are considering this evening. I'd like to suggest an additional condition which would require development to commence on site within 1 year of any grant of permission. And the other factor is, Chairman, that there is a valid enforcement notice still on this site, which would require the total demolition of the building and removal of materials from the site. And I think that's, in my view, Chairman, is another incentive for the applicant to actually get on and do something if members are minded to approve the application. Thank you, Chairman.
Right, thank you for that. That's very clear. So we come to discussions, questions. Who would like to kick off on this one, please? Councillor Jones.
Got a number of points, really. It was heartening to have reference to the rainwater reuse, the insulation and the heat recovery system, which I think is the way to go in the future. Are those part of the conditions, or are they just words that could disappear? That's question number 1. Number 2, if we were to approve it, can we amend condition 4 to require the driveway to be made of porous surfacing, conscious of the recent floods that flowed down Melton Road, which is part of which is the discharge from this road. It seems to me reasonable, and we know that tarmac, if that tarmac's to be applied, can be porous. And one of the concerns in this area, I think, is that it does feel crammed in, and as you see from the photos, the character of the area is very much tree lined, so we're going to end up with 1 tree apparently from the TPO. So the other question is, can we require a replacement for the burnt tree, or some other tree planting which maintains the character of the road? Otherwise, I'm pretty concerned that the scale of the building will be too stark in that locality and therefore out of character. And lastly, a question: is condition 8 a withdrawal of permitted development rights, or is it simply a withdrawal of ability to put windows in the property? And allied to that, we've been told that the roof height will be maintained as originally intended by lowering all these windows. But what would happen if the applicant or the builder decided to carry on with the windows as currently constructed? Sorry, that's quite a few.
That's okay.
I wouldn't like my
that's a good
appearance
start.
here to be...
No, you're not in not in vain. The drainage of the driveway, doesn't condition 4 sort of cover that anyway? Because it says details have got to be given of measures to prevent unregulated discharge of water onto the from the driveway onto the public highway. So I would have thought that's covered, but we'll come back to that. And then the comments about the other condition and replacement trees. We've got a blank screen there. That's a bit worrying. Oh, it's back. Hold on just a second.
Got all the points, Chairman, written down. So, Chairman, in terms of the first point, the question was about the rainwater reharvesting, etc., that we heard about from the applicant's agent, and whether these were words or subject to conditions. They're not subject to conditions. If the applicant chooses to install those, then good. To a certain extent, Chairman, conditions have to satisfy certain tests. They have to be reasonable, necessary, relevant to planning, etc. Because the site is within the built-up area where principle of development is acceptable, we're not looking for any additional factors that give weight to the grant of planning permission. And for that reason, Chairman, your officers have not deemed it necessary, one of the tests, to condition that those matters are provided. That's the first one. In terms of the porous material on the driveway, Chairman, the latest plan for the driveway shows that it will be a permeable resin-bound drive, so that would be porous or permeable. So that would, and the condition says it's got to be constructed in accordance with the plan. So that's covered. At the moment, Chairman, we've only TPO'd one tree because only one tree satisfies the tests for TPO, and that is, firstly, that it has to be of some amenity to the area, and I don't think there's any dispute that both trees arguably contribute to the amenity of the area. The other test that we have to apply when we're looking at TPOs is one of the health and stability of the tree. Clearly, one is healthy, and your officer is quite happy to make a TPO on it. The other one, as I said, has had fire damage and disease, which renders it unsuitable for protection by a tree preservation order. As I say, at the moment, there's no suggestion that they will remove the tree, but clearly it would not be protected. It's not in a conservation area, etc. Condition 8 removes permitted development rights for classes A to D. So that includes extensions, alterations to the roof, any new window openings. So it's all basically those are the issues that are being removed by condition 8. And the question about what if development continued as it is at the moment. Well, clearly, if they didn't reduce the floor levels in the building and they didn't reduce the window sill levels, etc., they would be not in accordance with the approved plans. And arguably, we're in a situation already where the structure on site is unauthorised and there's an enforcement notice on it. So effectively, that enforcement notice would remain in effect unless they implemented or a scheme that was considered to be acceptable.
So we could get into another enforcement situation then, in effect.
Well, the current enforcement notice would remain valid as far as I'm concerned, Chairman. If what they build on site is unauthorised,
then it's an enforcement matter. Councillor Jones.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of people who might be listening, this council has acknowledged that there is a climate change emergency, and although planning considerations seem to be slightly back in the dark ages, it is an influence on many of us that if somebody's taking measures like heat exchange recovery systems, it may not be a planning consideration, but it is really important, and I think people would look very favourably upon that. The point I was asking about trees was not which was TPO'd and which wasn't, but we're requiring, I think, a scheme of planting or something in one of the conditions. And the point I'm making is this is a big building squeezed in, and it's in an area which is characterised by lots of trees in front gardens. And I just would express the wish that any plan that comes forward respects the fact that green vegetation at the front of the building will make it more in character with the area, whereas at the moment I think it would look pretty ugly.
So really what you're saying is can there be any extra trees planted at some point? But Mr. Peckham.
Chairman, 2 points. Firstly, in terms of planning being in the dark ages, I'm afraid to say that up until about 4 years ago, we had a thing called code. No, you're attacking the regime. Yes, but yeah, and the frustration of your officers, Chairman, is about 4 years ago we had a thing called Code for Sustainable Homes, and that set a range of measures that developers would have to comply with to deliver sustainable housing, right down to not just insulation and reharvesting, but where you sourced materials from to ensure that they weren't being brought from the other side of the world and it was unsustainable. Unfortunately, the government, in its wisdom, decided to actually scrap Code for Sustainable Homes, and they've said that it was the responsibility of the building regulations to actually control those matters of insulation. Unfortunately, building control effectively only covers one aspect of all of the issues that were covered by Code for Sustainable Homes. It only covers the insulation and the U values of the property. So your officers are somewhat frustrated, Chairman. I am fully aware of the priority for this council to deliver energy efficient or low carbon housing, and we will continue to encourage developers to do that. Unfortunately, Chairman, until the government changes the policy, we haven't necessarily got the policy framework to back up that desire, but we will continue as best we can. In terms of the landscaping, Chairman, my suggestion perhaps would be a slight tweak to condition 10, which would require the landscaping scheme to include trees to be retained. They might then indicate the tree at the front to be retained, or if it was to be removed, we could seek replanting through that landscaping scheme. I don't know if that would satisfy Councillor Jones's concerns.
I think that's a sensible suggestion. Would you be happy with that?
I'd be happy with anything which retains the character of the area, which it currently would not be likely to.
I think we could add that as a condition then. Councillor Walker, did you have your hand up?
No, but I do have a question though.
Oh, well,
so
I could see from your body language you were anxious to jump in.
Yeah, I suppose the thing that springs up to me is the fact that it's 37% bigger than the original footprint. And I know we're not allowed to comment on it as that, but are there any conditions that kind of reflect that and also reflect the fact that a lot of the residents have talked about the fact that it's overlooking their properties?
Chairman, yes, in terms of the footprint, clearly, I go back to, oh, that will do, that one shows it actually. So this, as I say, shows the footprint of the previously approved dwelling. They didn't build that. What they built was something on the footprint of the grey area. This isn't a situation where, for instance, if, I don't want to pick, well, if someone was to demolish this property and want to build a replacement on the site, it's not a case that in the built-up area we apply a percentage limit of increase. It is down to an assessment of the size of the building within the plot and the impact on the area. So in terms of your question, really, the size of the building has been assessed by your planning officers, and to a certain extent, in terms of impact on neighbours, future extensions, etc., the mitigation measures that we have put forward to reduce or provide control over future extensions and alterations is through the conditions in the report which take away the permitted development. So yes, we are you wouldn't take away permitted development in every circumstance. I think the reason we consider it to be justified here is we do recognise that, yes, it's quite a big footprint on a modest-sized plot. Having said that, the garden area is 178 square metres and still satisfies our guidelines for gardens of properties of this type. Thanks, Chairman.
So really, yes, the condition 8 is quite unusual to have that in an application such as this, and it does give considerable protection against what may happen in the future. But as ever, we can only talk about the actual application that's in front of us at the moment. But thank you for that. Councillor Thomas.
Thank you. This seems to be quite a large property with accommodation over 4 floors, including, is it 5 bedrooms and 5 living rooms? Is that right?
5 bedrooms, yes.
There's two living rooms in the basement, a cinema and a playroom. Is that right? And 3 on the ground floor.
So, Chairman, if I just explain at this point, there's 3 reception rooms on the ground floor. Well, this is a kitchen family room, dining room and a lounge. There is a playroom and a cinema proposed in the basement. 3 bedrooms on the first floor and 2 bedrooms within the roof space. So that's 5 in total.
So it's 5 reception rooms, or living rooms, 5 bedrooms, and it seems to me to be very squashed into the plot, with only parking spaces for 2 cars for a property this size, and those parking spaces seem to be quite difficult to get into and mean, if you know what I mean. So I'm concerned about the parking. And I'm concerned about the how it's cramped onto the plot, which is against the character of the area, which has got the houses more spread out in bigger gardens. Although I would like to see the picture of the other side of the road again at some stage, please. But the thing that what the residents have been saying is they're concerned about flooding issues and drainage issues and the water table because of the construction of the basement, and that doesn't seem to have been addressed in the officer report or counted in the officer report, and I was just wondering if there were any comments on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So a little bit worried about the car parking provision, just apparently two spaces, and the access in and out of it, would it cause problems? Are you thinking perhaps of on-road parking type of thing, and pressure and such like? Yeah.
It's a very big house.
Yeah.
It would probably have big cars and, more than 2, is my thinking.
Okay, understand what you're saying, and then you're making the point again about the perception is crammed in onto the plot, but in particular we're curious about the drainage or possible drainage implications with the basement, and have we got any? Please.
Chairman, obviously, in terms of the size of the building, that's for members as planning committee and decision makers to consider whether it's appropriate. Your officers are satisfied with the proposal and have put forward the recommendation to grant, but as I say, that's clearly you as decision makers who can consider that issue. There are only 2 parking spaces, Chairman. However, highways don't object, is the first point, and that includes they've looked at the manoeuvring of vehicles, and in fact, one of the reasons we have originally the driveway was shown to go right way across the front of the frontage, so therefore the cars could potentially reverse into that area and then out. Part of the reason we've amended the scheme through negotiation is to protect the protected tree and see that retained. As I say, highways are satisfied, 1, with the level of parking, and 2, the layout in terms of how they would manoeuvre in and out of that site. There are only 2, Chairman, but the site is highly sustainable, within easy walking distance of local shops, and it's not an area necessarily where you'd expect a lot of, there's clearly less dependency on the private car here. They can use either foot, cycle or public transport. Chairman, the site is in a flood zone. Much of West Bridgford is a flood zone area. However, Chairman, we have already granted permission for a dwelling on the site, and usually the issue is about where sleeping accommodation is located, preferably not on ground floor, which is not in this case. The issue of groundwater, Chairman, I know it's been raised as a concern by residents, but it's one really more appropriately dealt with under the building regulations, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you. And paragraph 51 does refer to the revised parking arrangements, so there has been thought and consideration given to that as part of the revised plans. Councillor Brennan, please.
Thank you. My first is one of clarification, really. You talked about the fact that this building has been partially completed on that site for some period of time and therefore want to encourage this to move within a given timescale of a year. Can I just ask as a clarification, is there a requirement by when the enforcement notice has to be applied? Is there a point by which this building needs, the one on the current site needs to be demolished? That's my first point, which is one just of clarification for me. The second couple of points are, I reiterate the points of my colleague here about the size of it. I had a drive down there this afternoon, and I understand the one that's on the site is not going to be retained, but it still is a very large building in a very small space, and it does seem to me to overbear the road quite considerably, even though I recognise that those properties up there on the screen now are on a higher elevation. Nonetheless, the 3 stories, and 4 if you include the basement, but the 3 visible stories does seem to me to be exceptional on that road in terms of the scale and size of the building. The other point, which you may well have already addressed that anyway, but the other point is you've said that you're satisfied that the style is more in keeping with the rest of the area than the original or than the one that's currently on the site. Are you satisfied that the materials, because you say you are but you don't say what they are in the information, in terms of the materials that are being used, are also in keeping, because it is quite a distinctive area and it would be nice to retain the sort of the red brick and the similar sort of styles of the area, so that this is not noticeably both much bigger and also of a characteristically different design. Thank you.
Right, a couple of points there. The query about the length of time for the enforcement deadline, how that works, and take your point about your view is you feel it's overbearing, and that's your view. So we can't answer that really. That's your view.
Chairman, I'll take the last question first, if I may, while we've got this picture on the screen, because you can see there is a mix of pallet materials in the area. There's brick, there's render. The proposed dwelling, if I now go to the elevations, you'll see that proposal is for a mix of brick, render. There's also some timber cladding proposed on the bay windows here. So the materials are considered to be compatible or sympathetic to the area, given the mix that's in the area. In terms of visible floors, clearly it appears, yes, it's a large dwelling, but it appears as a 2-storey dwelling in my view, with rooms in the roof space. The basement is not particularly apparent, in that elevation. Yes, it's raised up above ground level a little bit, but there's I would take that to be effectively viewed as a 2-storey house with rooms within the roof. It does clearly provide accommodation over 4 floors. I'm not trying to ignore that fact, but just in terms of the character of the building in the area, that's why your officers have considered it to be appropriate. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Sorry, and
yes.
the enforcement notice.
Sorry. Oh yes, the enforcement.
The enforcement notice was served on the 15th of February. It took effect on the 18th of March, and the time periods for compliance within that notice were 6 months to remove the walls, 6 months to remove the basement substructure and fill in the basement with appropriate material, and then 8 months, in other words, a further 2 months from the effective date to remove all materials from the site. Now, you're probably doing the maths. Yes, we are past the 6 months, Chairman. Clearly, though, the applicant submitted an application which we have been negotiating on, and the decision as to whether or not to take further action on the back of the enforcement notice is one of expediency. And clearly, until this application is determined, your officers didn't feel it expedient to take any further action, but that notice still remains in force and can be enforced. So effectively, technically speaking, there is an offence under the enforcement notice, but as I say, it's a matter of expediency, given that we are currently dealing with an application to seek to remedy the issue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Verdi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question regarding it's paragraph 23S. There are references in terms of local residents' responses and the Human Rights Act, Protocol 1 and Article 1 and Article 8, particularly with reference to property and land and private and family life. And I have noted our officer's comments on page 40, paragraphs 53 to 56, in terms of balancing the rights of objectors to those of developers. But the question I have is, are we confident and content that there is no potential future recourse to, taking action with regards to those protocols in respect of the decision we have made? Because it has been addressed. I have noted that and acknowledged that, but I would just like clarification and the confidence that our legal advice has confirmed that there will be no comeback on those particular issues.
Chairman, Mrs. Soul may wish to add if I leave anything out, but effectively the human rights requirements and the consideration of a planning application almost run parallel. In effect, the human rights legislation reinforces the considerations that we have to have when we're considering a planning application. So it is, to a certain extent, in a planning world, it's a matter of judgment to a certain extent, and your officers have considered the impacts on neighbouring properties, and we don't consider that the impacts would be unacceptable. That's not to say there would be no impact. All development, as I've said previously, has some impact. And it's obviously, officers and your job as decision makers to determine when that impact is unacceptable. But effectively, the Human Rights Act runs parallel with the planning legislation in considering and protecting the amenities of residents.
Yeah, nothing further to add other than any decision of this committee is the regime for challenges by way of judicial review rather than via the Human Rights Act challenge.
Okay. Right, thank you. Right, we've had quite a discussion on this. Oh, Councillor, you're coming back?
Well, can we just clarify further to what the councillor's just said, that consideration that numbers 147 and 149 Melton Road feel that they're being overlooked? Can we just clarify what the distances are and what the angles are?
Best way I can do it, Chairman, is to make reference to the plans. Remembering that that footprint is the total footprint of the dwelling, part of that footprint, probably roughly along that same line, is single storey. The distance from the back of the single storey element to the rear boundary is 10.14 metres. So that's from the ground floor element. Obviously, when you step up, it's further from the first floor element. Chairman, I think, as I said previously, all development has some impact. And yes, there may be a degree of overlooking that would result. Arguably, we are in a built-up area where it's not unusual to get a degree of mutual overlooking of rear gardens and properties. But in this instance, your officers have considered this, and part of the reason the previous scheme was considered unacceptable was because of the elevated nature of the windows and the windowsills, which gave greater level of overlooking, if you like, of neighbouring properties. In particular, the ground floor element was, the single story element at the rear was elevated out of the ground, as you've seen from the photographs, and anyone standing in windows would be able to look over what would be your normal 6-foot fence down either side. By dropping that down to ground level, any boundary treatment that's installed would help to mitigate impacts and overlooking. The other aspect is, and it's in the conditions, Chairman, that window is an ensuite, that is a bathroom, and that is a landing. And you'll see that the conditions require that those 3 windows are obscure glazed. Also, in terms of, and I'm not sure it's on this one, you can see here, and it's a bit small, I know, but you can see there's a Velux roof window there. The sill level of that window is shown to be 1.7 metres above the floor level of the room which it serves. And if I just, you're talking about that sort of height. So you wouldn't be able to look down on the neighbouring gardens. So as far as your officers are concerned, with the conditions and the changes to the scheme, we believe that we have sought to safeguard the amenities of neighbouring properties from unacceptable overlooking.
Okay, thank you. And I think paragraphs 46 to 48 help to confirm that. Councillor Stockwood, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, we've got to the point after some considerable time of the history of this building. It's been unfortunate that previous plans have not been fully complied with. However, I think we've raised many pertinent questions this evening, which have been answered by the officer. We have lots of conditions which we have strengthened as we've gone along this evening, and I very much welcome the one to commence within 1 year that Mr. Pegram mentioned early on. So somewhat reluctantly, but I will propose the recommendation that planning permission be granted, subject to all those conditions.
Thank you, and the additional conditions as well.
Yes.
Do you have a seconder for that, please? Councillor Purdue-Horan, thank you very much. Right, I don't think anyone, we all spoke, we've probably not a lot more to say. We've had quite a discussion on this. We've got the recommendation as listed and amended. To approve, we need to make a decision. So, traditional way of doing so, show of hands for those in favour of the recommendation as discussed. Please show your hands. And that's, and is there anyone against? One against, and were there any abstentions? No, so that was, how many was that? Nine. Oh, of course, yeah. So that's 9 in favour, 1 against, so that means permission is granted as per the report and the amended conditions. And we will watch with great interest to see how this progresses. Thank you. No option really on that, is there? So welcome back, Councillor Goland. We'll go on to our next application now, which is the Old Schoolhouse, Station Road, Widmerpool. This is the construction of a new dwelling in the grounds of the old schoolhouse, and it's a resubmission, but as ever, we can only discuss what's before us. So, Mr. Pegram, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, the application before you this evening seeks full planning permission for the construction of a dwelling within what is currently part of the garden area to an existing property. You'll see that the site is located at the junction of Keyworth Road and Station Road in Widmerpool. There's an existing former schoolhouse here with a bungalow attached to the rear, and the application site is the triangular area I'm indicating on the screen. Again, that's the aerial photograph, and I think it's pertinent at this point, Chairman, to pause and note the character of the area that this site is located within. The main body of Widmerpool is down here. The area here is considered and has in fact previously been described by a planning inspector as an area of more sporadic development. So that effectively is relevant in terms of considering the context of the site and the character of the area. So this is the looking at the application site from Keyworth Road. That's the entrance into the site. That's the existing properties I referred to, and you go down here and Station Road carries off round in front of those properties. That's looking more head-on towards the application site. You can see through the trees. And then looking back up Keyworth Road in a more northerly direction with the application site on your right. Standing outside the site, again looking up Keyworth Road to the north. And then turning around, looking back the other way towards the junction I referred to and the existing properties. That's looking across at the property on the opposite side of the road from the application site, and then standing within the site looking out of the access towards Keyworth Road. Turning a bit more to the left, looking at the roof of that neighbouring property. And then again, this is now in the eastern corner of the site, looking back towards the existing properties at the Front Station Road. That's looking in a generally easterly direction to the eastern boundary with the fields beyond. And then that's looking northerly towards the sort of tip of the triangle of the application site. So, Chairman, the proposal is, as I say, it's a full application, so the details you are being asked to consider are those you see on the screen. Access where the 5-bar gate is, parking area in front of a dwelling facing onto Keyworth Road. The proposed dwelling would be 1.5 storey, so it's ground floor with accommodation predominantly within the roof space at first floor. So that's the elevation that would face Keyworth Road. That's the southeast elevation facing back towards the existing properties, and then rear elevation and the northern elevation. Chairman, the consideration of this application really turns on whether or not the proposal before you this evening constitutes, constitutes limited infilling. Members will be familiar with policy 3 of the core strategy, which sets a hierarchical approach to the delivery of housing within the borough, with a concentration on delivering the majority of the housing in the built-up area of West Bridgford and adjacent the principal urban area. We then identify 6 settlements for growth, and you'll also be aware that through the local plan part 2, we have identified further settlements where we believe growth can take place. Withmer Pool has not been identified either in the core strategy or in the emerging local plan part 2 as an area for growth. It therefore falls to be determined under the other settlements in policy 3 of the core strategy, which is based on housing to meet local needs, which will be delivered on small scale infill plots. Chairman, I don't dispute this is small scale. However, I would argue that it's infill. It's got nothing to the north. It's got nothing to the east. As I say, the previous inspector who dealt with an appeal in this area described this as a sporadic area of development outside of the main settlement. And your officers are firmly of the view that this does not constitute small-scale infill and is therefore encroachment into the open countryside and unacceptable. On that basis, Chairman, the application is before you with a recommendation to refuse planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 2 speakers on this item as well. The first is Harriet Evans, and you're here to speak on behalf of a neighbour, I think, aren't you? So as we saw before, we've got up to 5 minutes, and as soon as you're ready, press the right button, the red light will come on, and the clock will start counting down. So whenever you're ready, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, the current resident owner of Westview is my mum. She's been there just over 25 years now. Gets on with the neighbours, it's absolutely fine. The only thing we have that we're really concerned about is the water table, because though after my comments somebody put a comment in and said it's not a problem, they only mentioned the fact it was due to the, I wanted to say cesspits, they're called something, soakaways, being in a certain place so it won't matter, but they haven't mentioned the foundations. Bearing in mind the garden of Westview is 8 foot lower than what I call a field, but it's obviously part of his garden. So I think, I don't know how deep foundations have to be in a house, whether it's 4 or 5 foot, something like that. So if it's 5 foot, then there's only 3 foot below that house difference to where the garden is of Westview. So I'm concerned that the water table could be quite affected and could cause flooding or damp to Westview. And the mum, when she moved in 25 years ago, spent lots of time and money on her garden because it's her, yeah, she's obviously retired and whatever. And the other thing is they've recently had to put a new drain in on the corner of Keyworth Road and Station Road because it always floods on that corner and causes quite a lot of splashing. So I'm thinking the drainage from where the proposed site is, if it's coming down, will then end up on that road as well because it's downhill on Keyworth Road. I would say that is actually, as her children, you know, my siblings agree with this, and that's our main concern really, more than anything. But that's it. That's all I really need to say tonight because I've said everything in my comments. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Sorry, I was a bit nervous then. I've
No,
not done
no,
that
it's-
before.
believe you me, those of us who are supposed to know what we're doing find it quite nerve-wracking
Sorry,
as well. So please
I'm
don't
still
worry.
on.
Yeah.
I believe there have been no bore tests done to find out about the water table. So how can they actually say there will be no effect on the water table? I believe there haven't been, unless somebody can tell me otherwise.
We can ask the question.
Thank you.
Okay, super. Thank you
I'll
very
leave this
much.
on.
No, if you, no,
Okay.
press it again because it needs to go off.
Left one or the right one?
Right one. That's it. Thank you very much. Right, and our other speaker on this is one of the local ward members, Councillor Edivine, please. Up to 5 minutes as soon as you're ready. Yeah, we've got your name badge as well with forward planning. Just in case you forgot who you were, that's...
Thank you. Chairman and members of the committee, we as ward members support this application. The report states that this is a resubmission and some amendments to the first submission have been made. The reason for the resubmission is that the applicant sought the advice of ward members after the refusal. Had he sought our advice prior to the first refusal, we would have supported the original application. Whilst the report raises some questions with regard to the design and provision of environmentally friendly features, these could surely be covered with conditions should the committee see fit to approve the application. And indeed, surely conditions can be put in place if we, if so wish, to cover the representation that's just been made. Emphasis is also put on the lack of amenities and public transport, suggesting therefore that it is unsustainable. If this is the case, then no development should be allowed in almost all of the small villages found in the rural parts of our borough, and this would be frankly bonkers. The primary reason for refusal is that the proposal is deemed to be outside the area of the village. The ward members feel, yes, it is on the edge of the village, but outside, no, not in our opinion. If you look on Apple Maps or similar, you will see that it is within the existing garden of the old schoolhouse. To the south is a substantial property, and it is within 50 metres or so of the heart of what Widmerpool used to be, a concentration of old cottages and houses, presumably to support the old rectory and Widmerpool Hall. To the east is Old Hall Drive, with its several substantial dwellings. To the north-east, which hasn't even been shown on that map, is Widmerpool Hall, once owned by the Automobile Association and now converted into apartments with multiple new houses built in its grounds several years ago. This site does not take away any open countryside. It's in a garden bordered to the north by hedges, which will remain. And this house will contribute to the mix of housing available in Widmerpool, which is otherwise in danger of being characterised by a village where only the wealthy can live. Most houses in Widmerpool sell for more than £500,000. Indeed, the last house to be built was also in the corner of a garden, also on the edge of the village, and sold for around £700,000. Funnily enough, it's slightly larger than the one we're looking at now. Communities should be able to accommodate a mixed population, and this house could contribute towards that. I know that planning is not about the current inhabitants, but building houses like this gives opportunities for less well-off people to buy into villages such as Widmerpool in the future. And please consider that one of the problems with the housing market is the so-called elderly bed blockers refusing to downsize. Well, here is an applicant who wants to downsize, free up his existing house for someone else, and stay where he has lived for many years, which is why we're supporting this application. Reference has been made to a previous application and the inspector's comments. This was in 2006, 13 years ago. The world has moved on, and indeed the hall, to which I refer, has been substantially redeveloped and should be considered part of the village. Thank you.
Thank you. Well within time again, so that's good. Thank you very much. So we have no other speakers on this. So we heard from Ms Evans, who was really speaking on behalf of her mother, who lives at Westview, worried about water table flooding and so on, and querying about foundation depths. And then Councillor Edivine, who, along with his colleague, supports the application because he considers it's not inappropriate, and also points out the other issues such as house prices and availability of housing, and also, of course, the Widmerpool Hall conversion a few years ago. I think that covers most things. Anything to add on that, please? Oh, sorry. Oh, Councillor Golan. Yeah. We're just bringing, yes, Mr. Pegram. Just waiting for Mr. Pegram.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry for the delay. I was just looking on the map to familiarise
You can't
myself.
see what I can see here, but it's frantic computer maps and things.
Yes, Chairman. Just in terms of the comments from the lady who spoke on behalf of the neighbour, most of those issues, Chairman, would be dealt with under building regulations. So the building regulations would ascertain the appropriate depth of footings that would be needed for a dwelling on this site, given the ground conditions. They would also, if they wanted to use soakaways, they'd probably want infiltration tests done to determine whether the ground conditions were conducive to that type of drainage. So those issues are really addressed by other legislation, i.e. the building regulations. I was just, sorry Chairman for the delay there, I was just familiarising myself with the location of Widmerpool Hall in relation to the application site, and it's effectively, you can see a belt of trees just running off the plan here. It's behind those trees, and I think you'll vouch for me that's effectively where Widmerpool Hall sits.
I remember when it was the AA, I do.
Yes. Chairman, I know the appeal decision is 2006, 13 years ago. The area, apart from the conversion of Widmerpool Hall, perhaps, has not changed significantly, and certainly there's no change in the immediate environs of the application site in terms of other development that's taken place. Chairman, I would draw members' attention in particular to, and I had it just now and I've lost it now, but the contents of the comments in paragraph 14, which set out the paramount policy considerations for this application, really, and that is that in this settlement, which is not a settlement identified for growth, development will be to meet local needs delivered on small-scale infill plots. You've heard, Chairman, that the application is apparently for the owner of the neighbouring property to move into and downsize. There's been no local needs assessment submitted with this application, but fundamentally, Chairman, it's not considered that this is small-scale infill. As I said previously, it has nothing to the north, it has nothing to the east. It is extending the footprint of built development into the countryside. Widmerpool Hall is somewhere over here, so although that has been converted into dwellings, clearly it was an existing building and converted, not a new build. And again, the distance is such that I don't think you could consider that to be infill development. What we have got, Chairman, as a result of our emerging local plan part 2, is something we haven't had before, which is something more of a definition of infill development, which is a small gap in the existing built fabric. Chairman, I don't consider this site to be within the existing built fabric, and although it may be very nice for the current owner of the neighbouring property to stay in the village and move into this property, there'd be no control over that, and it could be sold on the open market. It's not being put forward as an exception needs housing site, which we do have sometimes for affordable type housing. And on that basis, Chairman, your officers remain of the view that this is contrary to policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Councillor Golan, please.
So I feel we need some sort of consistency measures here. We've just approved a very large overbearing house in the middle of the town, and I've already argued that I agree that we need infill in the town. But this is a very small house, and I can see Google Maps. I don't know if anybody else has looked at Google Maps. I don't know if you can see it, but this is all the built-up area, and it's there. It's right. It's not in the middle of it, but it's right on the edge of it, and it's right tucked into that corner. So I personally can't see any problem with this particular little house in the corner of Widmerpool.
Okay, thank you. That's fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. That's what we're here for. Councillor Walker, are you agitating?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Sorry, that's wrong. I didn't mean agitating. Indicating to speak.
That was a bit of agitating. Yeah. You're right. As a councillor for somewhere like Ruddington, looking at this, it just seems quite odd, and I kind of will echo what Councillor Golan has just said, because these recommendations from the Planning Committee are the exact points that people from Ruddington put against the housing development in Ruddington. So there does seem to be this lack of consistency that it's okay for some parts of the borough, but not for others. And as a new councillor, I need to maybe look to understand that a bit more in depth, because it appears unjust to a certain extent. And it is a little house.
Okay, you have to remember, of course, that as well as the application we're looking at, we have to look at overall council policy, and indeed national policy as well, the national planning framework. So we have to consider all those aspects as well. And whilst it may be a little house, this site itself is completely different to perhaps some of the sites you've seen in Ruddington, the site we just discussed in West Bridgford. And so that's why we're always saying we can only discuss the actual application that's in front of us, and because every application is different. But at the same time, there are planning policies of this authority and indeed national policies that have to be considered when we're making our decision. But I understand what you're saying, and absolutely everyone's got their right to make those points. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, Chairman, only that it's quite often said that there's no common sense in planning. And I say that myself as a planner. Councillor Walker refers to other developments in Ruddington, and I suspect what she's probably referring to are the development on Asher Lane, the development proposed on Wilford Road, and clearly, Chairman, the difference there is that Ruddington, firstly, is identified as one of our settlements for growth in the core strategy. The level of growth that we need to deliver in those towns cannot be accommodated on plots within the town or village, and there is therefore an inevitable creep into the countryside and release of greenbelt. However, Chairman, that is as you say, a policy position of this council. We have identified those sites for planned development, whereas this is more speculative development on a plot on the edge of an unsustainable village, which is not considered to be small-scale infill. And that's the crux of it, Chairman. If there were other properties around it, and it was maybe down in the village down here, somewhere there was a plot, then clearly that may be considered to be infill. But where we are here, and to read the comments of the inspector, as I say, the character of the area has not changed in this particular area since the 2006 decision. He says, however, I agree with the council that the site lies in an area of sporadic development beyond the settlement and in the countryside. And that is the crux of this one, Chairman, really. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that's helpful. But again, it's difficult decisions. That's what we do. So we have to look at all the facts and come to our own views. Right, we've got a list of speakers now. My next speaker is Councillor Brennan, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to support Councillor Gowland's view on this. I too had a look at if you look, I know nobody can see this except me, but the development of the hall gives you an entirely different perspective looking down on the plot, if that's included in your picture. That does look like it's on the edge of the village. When you see it in the context of the hall, it does look rather different. And I would suggest that this is infill because it's in somebody's garden. It's not encroaching into open countryside, as I understand it. This is already a residential gardens plot. and therefore it's already fenced off from the surrounding country, as it were, and you are infilling onto that space. And I think it's entirely a reasonable proposition that you should build in that space on that garden. I can't see how that extends the village, especially when you look down on the village in its wider context, any more than it already is, because it's within the boundaries of an existing residential property. So I would say it is infill.
Okay, thank you. Mind you, it could be, although we don't know what might happen in the future, but what would happen if someone said, okay, well, they've built there's a property there, let's build another one next to it and next to it.
Well, if I may,
that's a speculation, of course.
Because that is agricultural land and open land surrounding it, so there's an argument that would be encroachment into the green space or the countryside, but this is not. This is within the boundaries of an existing property. It's in a garden.
Anything to add to that, Mr. Pegram?
Chairman, I think the concept of infill is for some people difficult to grasp perhaps, but because it's a garden area doesn't make it infill. Yes, it may be in residential use, but it's not on that basis alone infill. Perhaps I can suggest if that garden were that big and it was still garden, would you consider that to be infill if it was right up at the tip of the garden there? And I think, Chairman, the difficulty is that the legislation and planning law doesn't provide a clear definition of what infill is. Hence, we have sought to try and address that issue through our local plan part 2, which talks about infill being a small, small-scale infill within the built fabric, and the influence of that is it's between or within a group of buildings. This is, although it is garden area, this is still encroaching out into the countryside, in my view. Widmerpool Hall, I've just had a quick look. I can't find it, and whether the ward councillor can nod, but it was a conversion of a building. It may have been a listed building, and that may have been one of the justifications for the conversion of that building to maintain it and keep it as a historic hall, even if it's a non-designated heritage asset. Conversion is different to new build in the countryside. So I don't think you can use the justification of Widmerpool Hall. You can't use the justification of Asher Lane. This has to be considered on its merits, and you have to determine whether this is small-scale infill, Chairman.
Absolutely. Thank you. Councillor Jones, please.
Far be it from me to support planners, but
Thank you,
and I've sat here many times thinking, why the hell are we cramming so much into West Bridgford and Ruddington and Eastleigh? It doesn't make sense when you see the spacious, high-expense housing in these leafy parts of the borough. And I look forward to a day when the local plan is revised and somebody decides something different will happen. But I accept the policy position at the moment is clear. It's not just the inspector. Our own decision in 2018 refused it in the same location on the same basis. I mean, we've heard from the speaker on behalf of the nearby resident that there's a steep bank between what would be this smaller house and the cottage, the small cottage that she lives in. And I note that even in design terms, it's proposed to be finished in larch cladding, which is hardly compatible with the character of the area. Hence, I imagine that's why recommendation 2 exists. So I support the recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Are you actually moving that recommendation? Is that what you're saying? Are you moving the recommendation? Yes. Oh, you can do. You're very welcome to. If you, well, I've got a few more speakers on the list there, but are you going to hold your water for now? Yeah, hold your horses for now, right? Councillor Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. It seems to be fairly questionable as to whether it's infill or not. That's the discussion we're having. There is a large tractor shed on this plot, and there's also a building in the tip of the triangle, as I understand it. So there is some building on the site, which would, you know, has kind of extended the built area of the village to a certain extent into this garden area. So I think it's questionable as to whether it's infill or not. It's also it's not, strictly speaking, an exception site for local needs as defined. However, it is in the spirit of providing for local needs in terms of providing for an older couple to downsize. And in terms of intrusion into the countryside, well, it really is marginal compared to the wholesale destruction of the countryside that's taking place around some of our villages. So I would not agree that the first reason is sufficient to refuse this application. The second reason for refusal is about the design, and I don't feel that Widmerpool has a very strong design, uniform design, and that this is particularly against. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with the second reason for refusal either. My concern, there is a concern for the neighbour of the cottage adjacent, which is at a lower level and very close to the property. However, I understand from some of the paperwork that the house has been set back so that it's not adjacent to the neighbouring property, and there's even an offer to move the drive further across to you know, reduce the impact of having the drive close to the property in question. So I think, although I have quite a lot of sympathy for the residents of that cottage, I think you know, that those issues can be dealt with by conditions and by for, you know, carrying on with the planning process, as it were. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, yeah. Well, I wasn't really going to say anything. I was just going to ask clarification of Councillor Jones if he was going to move the. So you're moving the recommendation as per the report for refusal. Do you have a seconder for that at this stage? Councillor Verdi, are you? I'm seconding. So you're seconding that. Councillor Golan, you indicated to speak. Do you want to come back? Is your microphone on? Can't hear you.
It's an acute angle on those two roads. The house is near the top of the red. You know, it's between the obviously along the long left-hand side of that triangle. On the other side of the road, on the left-hand side, you can't see on that map. There are houses, so it's pretty much in line with the house on the other side of the road. So you know, it's really a matter of opinion. I think it's very close to being infill in that position, and I have huge sympathy about the drains, and it's just ridiculous that we cannot consider drainage. But if we consider it on infill, it just doesn't seem sensible to say it's not.
Okay, thank you. We might have to do some more sessions on what is infill, explanations.
I'll be happy to attend those.
I'm sure, yes.
Not deliver them, attend them.
Right. So anyway, we thank you for that. Now, Councillor Jones, you moved the recommendation to refuse as per the report. Councillor Verdi, just to confirm, are you seconding that recommendation? Yes. Do you want to say anything to that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would really reinforce the comments already made by our officers and in support of Councillor Jones in terms of, although we're talking about subjective judgments here, us as committee members, I think there was a third party involved here, and that was the inspector, who has come back and said that, you know, it is a sporadic development. And on page 55, again, in contrary to policy HOU2, point number F, the proposal does not fall within an area of sporadic or riven development would be the only reason it would be approved, and it does fall within that. So I think, you know, definitions of infill we can discuss here for a long time, but there seems to be clear breaches of policies in my view, which is why I'm happy to second the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Does anyone else wish to speak on this one, or shall we make a decision? Are you indicated to speak? Are you nodding as if you want to say something? No. Fine. We'll go to a decision. So, I think we've had a fair discussion on this, and there is plainly a mix of views, and that's absolutely fine. That's life, and that's how it goes. and we have to look at all the considerations, but we've got the recommendation as per the report, as moved and seconded. We need a show of hands now for those in favour of the recommendation, which is to refuse planning permission for the reasons shown. Can I have a show of hands, please? And we've got those, and those against that recommendation. 2, 3, 4, so that's 4. And were there any abstentions? Don't think there were any abstentions. So the numbers there are 6 in favour of 6 with recommendations refused and 4 against. So that means permission is. Could you give us a number? What's the number?
7 and 4.
So 7 and 4. So 7 in favour of the recommendation and 4 against. So that means permission is refused. Thank you. So we'll go on to our final application for tonight, which is the Stables Hall Farm, Chapel Lane, Granby. It's a removal of an entrance door, addition of an entrance lobby, and a detached kitchen extension in Granby. Mr. Pegram, please.
Thank you, Chairman. There was late representation on this one circulated to members yesterday. The application, lost my clicker, relates to the stables at Hall Farm. Basically, what we have here, Chairman, is a group of barn conversions to form dwellings. So historically used for agricultural purposes. The buildings have subsequently been converted to dwellings. So this is the application property. That's one dwelling. Then the northwestern leg of the group is another dwelling, and then this one here is a dwelling with the garages to those properties situated here. That's the aerial photograph showing the situation in relation to the settlement. And this is the property in question, Chairman. So their garage is here. That's the end of the leg of the barn that's a dwelling. You can see in the background the other 2 elements of that group that form a courtyard arrangement. That's again just looking at a slightly different angle. The proposed extension is to go in this area here, and then looking again at a slightly different angle across, and again extension in this position roughly here. That's looking at the parking area, the building end of the building. You can just see creeping in there, so it's behind those trees. And then standing within the garden of the property, and again the extension would come out from here. Would be located here, and I'll show you the plans in a minute in terms of the design approach that's being adopted. Standing a bit further back, looking at where the extension would go, and then looking across at the rest of that barn conversion, extension would be just in this sort of area over to the right here. That's looking across the garden at the other barn, the northwestern one, and looking at the other one in the group. So you can see historically, Chairman, they formed a courtyard arrangement around what would have been an operational courtyard to the farm. The design has come up quite an imaginative approach, to be quite honest. It is a barn. It has a sort of a heritage in agriculture. So the design approach that's been adopted is to design it as a sort of a round extension with a link into the main building, in an attempt to reflect what might be perceived as a silo, which is not uncommon on farms. Again, showing you the location of that extension. The crux of this one, Chairman, really is that the buildings are identified as important non-listed buildings. They are in the conservation areas, you can see by the red line. The green areas are important open spaces. And it's the view of your Conservation Officer, Chairman, that historically, if we go back to the agricultural heritage of these buildings, this would have been an open courtyard. We have got pictures that show in more recent years there was a lightweight agricultural structure filling the gap. That has been subsequently removed, and your Conservation Officer believes that to be a positive step in terms of improving the appearance of the group of buildings. Information was submitted by the applicant to show that there was historically silos on this site, but again an examination of that information and plans and everything shows that they were located outside the courtyard of the group of buildings. Chairman, it's the view of your officers and particularly your Conservation Officer that a extension in this position, whether it be as a mock silo or design in brick and tile, would actually interrupt and upset that character of the open courtyard area, and would therefore cause harm to the setting of the conservation area. Chairman, just to re-emphasise that point, Section 72 of the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act requires that, as decision makers, you must give special regard to the desirability for preserving and or enhancing the character and appearance of the conservation area. If we then apply the policy tests that are in the MPPF, if development causes any harm, it cannot be deemed to preserve or enhance. Harm can be either less than substantial, which is a huge range from no harm to what is the other level of harm, which is substantial harm. Your conservation officer believes that this would cause less than substantial harm. Harm, nevertheless, that in terms of policy requirements would have to be balanced against public interest or public benefits. And there are none in terms of this proposal. So, Chairman, it's your officer's view that the scheme is unacceptable because it affects buildings which are identified. They're not listed, but they are important unlisted buildings in the conservation area, and the proposal would affect the setting of those buildings and the setting of the conservation area, causing harm. It's therefore recommended for refusal, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. And we have two speakers on this item as well. So I'm assuming you're Mr. Owens. So Mr. Owens is going to be the agent for the applicant. So if you'd like to speak to us, please. And it's up to 5 minutes. Right-hand button, red light will come on, and the clock will start counting down. Okay.
Chairman and members, thank you for the opportunity to give some background to this application. I'm Hugh Owens, architect and agent for the application, speaking on behalf of my client, Paul and Paula Smith. Unfortunately, due to a close family bereavement, the applicant is unable to be here and has asked me to pass on their apologies to the... You've just heard objection to the proposal. Under normal circumstances, I usually agree with the views of the planning department to do an admirable job. However, very occasionally, I beg to differ on a professional level, that a unique set of circumstances influencing a design need to be viewed from a different perspective. The applicants have sought for nearly 10 years to simply add a modest kitchen extension within the three-sided range of Victorian farm buildings. Through a number of pre-application inquiries over the years, nothing has been acceptable, as they've all been considered detrimental to the open courtyard. Siting the extension outside of the courtyard was suggested by the Design and Conservation Officer. This, however, is not possible, as the applicant does not own or have the right to build on land outside the courtyard. The group of barns in question are at the end of an unadopted, semi-private cul-de-sac and generally not seen by the general public. Their contribution, therefore, is viewed from the green on Chapel Lane, which is noted as a focal point and visual stop in the conservation townscape appraisal. Also, from this green are identified important vistas, important open spaces in the direction of the outside face of the barns in question. Therefore, irrespective of whether the applicant owns or controls land outside of the group of barns, surely building outside of the courtyard would be detrimental to both of these points and fail to preserve or enhance the nature of the conservation area in this location. Siting the extension within the courtyard, therefore, in my opinion, preserves the nature of the conservation area. When I was appointed at the end of 2016, I was fully aware of the background and knew that this project would be a challenge. My approach to design is to blend contemporary with old, so each complement each other, enabling the history of a building to be clearly read. The previous history of this group of buildings was lost when they were converted to residential use in 2000. Functional additions to the original Victorian barns were stripped away, so turning the clock back. These included a portal frame agricultural shed that fully filled the courtyard and 3 large grain silos to the southwest. Photographic records of these structures gave inspiration for the current proposals. I agree that the introduction of a rectangular form does not sit well within the courtyard, but curved forms inspired by the silos, help soften the intrusion and blur the boundaries. The choice of material is also intended to contrast with the existing and give the extension an identity of its own, the dark timber cladding enhancing the red brick. We should respect our heritage and keep it for future generations, but buildings need to adapt. Older buildings have, in the main, survived because they have adapted to meet changing social and functional needs. This has led to many buildings being extended in a style current at the time, so adding to the pattern of history over centuries. In this instance, the history of the last 150 years has been erased, and efforts to keep it in the current state is, in my opinion, a distorted view of their history. This extension is in no way an attempt to replicate the past. It has a nod to the agricultural history, but looks to the future by adding something of quality, interest, that in the future will be seen as an appropriate response to the needs of the day. I hope that this has helped explain the background and give some insight to the factors driving the design. In my view, the proposal is for an interesting, quality, modest extension situated such that the wider conservation area is preserved and the range of barns enhanced with a contemporary addition appropriate to the constraints. I further hope that after consideration you'll agree and bring my client's 10-year quest for a modest kitchen extension to a successful conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Councillor Bailey, please. Ward member.
Thank you. Chairman and members of the committee. I have regularly sought advice from James Bate, the Conservation Officer, on applications within the conservation areas of my ward. I have found his advice useful and helpful when making consultee comments on applications, and I respect his knowledge in conservation matters. However, in this planning application, we have very, very different opinions on the merits of this particular application. The Stables Hall Farm is part of a three-sided conversion scheme which allowed the buildings to be retained to contribute to the historic character of the conservation area. The Conservation Officer says he does not know why the application has picked up on the former silo structures. He then goes on to say that circular forms are not currently seen within the site and could be considered incongruous, followed by other comments that he would worry that by introducing a building of this form in this position, it could distort the character of the buildings by suggesting a former structure which almost certainly never existed here. I contend the average person in the street would associate a silo shape as being in keeping with the structures found in the countryside, and therefore the shape would not be out of character. I showed the design you see across there to work colleagues and asked them what they associated the round shape with. The answer, a silo. Silos were located in the vicinity of the courtyard and were removed during the conversion to housing. The design solution proposed will add a positive modern element to the courtyard that will sit well with the stables, blending the old with the new. The Conservation Officer notes that timber cladding is not a local building material in South Nottinghamshire. However, examples of timber cladding in South Notts do exist, such as the large timber village hall in Althorpe, Colston Bassett Village Hall, Scarrington W.I. Hut, as well as a more modern example, the Branmere building at Nottingham Trent University's Brackenhurst site, and a modern house in Elton on the Hill, which has larch cladding. The courtyard setting the Conservation Officer refers to is not quite as it first seems, and if you look at the plan up there, top left, you can see quite clearly that the stables garden is the right-hand side of the courtyard, with its garden sweeping out. Now that garden takes approximately 50% of the courtyard, and is well shielded by trees and hedging that you've seen on the photographs. Vale View, which is the topmost barn conversion, the top of the U as it were, is the adjacent barn conversion at the top of the courtyard, and it too has a sizable part of the courtyard within its curtilage, which is also well screened. The granary on the left hand one coming down, has the remaining perhaps of 10% of the courtyard in the form of a strip. What is, I think, important is in reality, the courtyard no longer functions visually as it once did as one large open square space. It is now 3 attractive individual homes within the former courtyard. The planning officer emailed some photographs of the site asking me to take another look at this planning application. The photographs are clear, but in my opinion do not give the feel of the garden setting in which the extension would be sited. I visited the site together with photographs and plans and an open mind. The applicants were not at home, but I was able to go to the garden and get a feel for the garden in its former farmyard setting, and I am convinced the proposed extension will sit well with its surroundings. The Conservation Officer states, I am not convinced the design being advocated is such that it would warrant a more lenient view in regard to the principle of extension and development within a courtyard setting. I disagree with this statement. This design is well thought out, it is innovative, stylish, and blends the new with the old to complement one another. I do not believe the design will cause harm to the conservation area. The design will help to preserve the character of the courtyard and as a reminder of its previous agricultural use. I was heartened to see this application, which combines good design and modern materials. No comments either for or against have been received from neighbouring properties or from in the local conservation area, and additionally, Granby Parish Council do not object to this planning application. This planning application provokes very different reactions from people. It could be described as being like Marmite. You either love it or you hate it. The design is such that I believe it warrants a more lenient view in regard to the principle of extension and development in the courtyard setting and deserves to receive planning approval.
Okay, just a few seconds over 5 minutes, but I think we're okay with that. Thank you. So we heard from Mr. Owens, who usually agrees with planners, but not this time. And I'm sure you'll still be best friends, whatever. But explain the reason behind the application and design features, and explained that he doesn't think it will be seen from the public realm, and it helps. It's in keeping with the design of the home and the old barns. And Councillor Bailey also supports the application. She disagrees with the Conservation Officer over various points, and she says that the silo shape is in character with the area, and because there have been silos there before. She thinks it blends the old with the new very well, and with regards to the cladding, she gave some examples as to where there is cladding elsewhere in Rushcliffe. I think that's covered most points.
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add, right. So who would like to start off with this, please? Councillor Jones, please.
I'd just like clarification of something, really. I'm assuming that the applicant occupies all that wing of the building. All that, yeah. And another one occupies the other two. Another two, yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah. So two concerns really. One is I see the report says it would stick out 6.7 metres from the existing building. What is the width of the existing building that it would stick out from? In other words, the proportionate width into that area. And I suppose the second thing is, the Conservation Officer objecting so thoroughly is a bit like highways objecting to something. It's not that forcibly that common. So I'm just wondering, presumably he might have in mind, well, if the other wings all went for one of those, what would the overall impact be?
We've got the special ruler out here to work out the.
Not one I like using normally.
And again, we can't speculate on what might happen in the future.
But that's the issue about the conservation area,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
If one thing goes, then others go.
James, about 5.5 metres across. Oh, sorry, I'm It's about 5.5 metres across the end of that building. As you say, it sticks out 6.7 metres there. Just to...
So it's deeper than the existing building?
Which is depth? That one
Oh,
or
sorry,
that one?
width.
Yeah,
Whichever,
yeah.
whichever. It's bigger.
Yeah,
It's bigger.
if you're looking at that elevation, then the total projection is wider than that elevation, if that's the, just for the clarification point. Chairman, just to emphasise this point, in terms of the comments that the Conservation Officer made, that Councillor Jones has referred to, it's unusual, it's an unusual piece of legislation really, because the Section 72 of the Listed Building Conservation Areas Act imposes a statutory duty on you as decision makers. And if, as decision makers, you consider there is harm, whether it be less than substantial or substantial, then there is a statutory presumption for refusal of permission. And it's an unusual one because we have with the first application, a lot of judgment, but there was no statutory duty on you to refuse or approve that application. The legislation around listed buildings and conservation areas is very different and imposes a statutory duty on you. So in terms of this application, your options are, if you believe that the extension is acceptable and does not cause any harm to the conservation area, then clearly that preserves the conservation area. If you deem that the extension, as our conservation officer does, causes harm to the conservation area, even if that harm is less than substantial, if you were to resolve to grant permission, you would have to justify the scheme on the basis that there would be some public benefit to outweigh the harm. So those are your options as decision makers, and I think it's just important because there is a lot of case law, there's a lot of legal challenges around the application of Section 66 and 72 of the Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act. So just to set out your options there, those are your options as decision makers on this application.
Thank you. I hope that's helpful to colleagues. Things are not always as straightforward as one might hope and imagine. Does that help, Councillor Jones? Does that answer your question? Thank you. Yeah. Gosh, Councillor Goland, please.
Simple question. Do we know how old the original buildings are? Looking at them, they don't look that old to me, but I'm no expert.
It says in paragraph 1 that it's a late 19th century.
I know I've read it somewhere.
Late 19th century agricultural barn, so 19th century. Councillor Stockwood, anything you want to bring in on this?
Yes, I'm prepared to recommend that planning permission be refused for the reasons stated on page 66. There are numerous policies that this impinges on, and I do think, we should take serious note of our policies. Policy 10, design and enhancing local identity, 11, historic environment, core strategy of Plan Part 1, policies GP2, design and amenity criteria, and EN2, conservation areas, and the Rushcliffe Borough non-statutory replacement local plan and guidance contained within the National Planning Policy Framework. I don't see how we can go against any of that, really. It's been explained by the officer that we have a statutory duty to consider those, and I think it's quite sound, so I am happy to propose that we refuse.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Stockwood. Do you have a seconder for that proposal, please?
No idea.
Do we have a seconder? Councillor Hetherington.
Yes, I'll second it because I think personally that it is tagging something on to an extinct, quite a very, very important building in the area, and we're tagging something on that is a bit like, you're going out and putting a new flask on the end of whatever. And I think it worries me that not really working it into the original building. You know, the original building has got its own look and appearance and everything else, and this seems to be something we're just tagged on the edge, you know, so that's why I think I would be happy to actually support these.
Right, anyone else wish to speak on this? It's certainly an interesting application, and a difficult one again, I think, if I'm honest.
So can I just clarify?
Yeah.
Our decision is whether or not we think this is a material. What was the wording you used? Can you just exactly what we've got to decide?
We'll have a look at the recommendation on page 66. The proposed extension by virtue of its design materials, etc. It's all in there.
But there were some specific words you just used.
Just to be clear, Chairman, all of the usual planning considerations in terms of design and amenity apply. The one that I referred to was the Listed Building Conservation Areas Act, which imposes a statutory duty on you to give special regard to the desirability for preserving or enhancing the character and appearance of the conservation area. Now, obviously, as I said, the options you have is you can either deem that this does cause no harm and grant permission, or if you are minded to, or if you think it's harmful, you can refuse permission as set out in the report. But if you are minded to approve, then you would have to, as part of your resolution, specify what you thought the public benefits were that outweighed the harm. And as I say, it's a statutory test. So, and it's one where there's been a lot of challenges, and even down to the wording of making sure it's considered properly. So, thank you. Does that clarify the point for you, Councillor?
And sorry for my confusion as to what you were asking there. Right, I think we've probably had quite a good discussion on this, and we've heard a lot of detail about the not just the application itself, but also the policy and legal side of matters. We better make a decision, I think. So we've had the recommendation as shown on the report to refuse permission for the reasons shown. That was proposed by Councillor Stockwood and seconded by Councillor Hetherington. Can I have a show of hands, please, in favour of that recommendation to refuse as per the report? And we got those? And anyone against? Any abstention? So that's 10 for the recommendation and 1 abstention. So that means the recommendation is carried as per the report, and permission is for this application is refused. Thank you. Right, so that was the final new planning application for tonight. The final item on the agenda is really a noting item, or if people want to say anything about them, you can do. This is a report of recent planning appeals. For information, do you need to add anything to this, Mr. Pegram? Or
no, Chairman.
No.
Unless there's
Okay.
any
So,
questions.
any questions on these appeals and any comments? No. I do remember the Moor Lane Gotham, because that came to us twice, didn't it? And I remember thinking at the time that was a classic borderline one, where on the night it was a really difficult decision. It's an infill matter, as it happens, the interpretation of infilling, and I think on one of them we went against I think the original officer recommendation was approval, and the committee disagreed. But anyway, whatever. We've lost the appeal on that. So I'm waffling now, so I'll shut up. So there we are. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Pegram.
Chairman, just one final point, and his reference was made to him this evening. I'm not sure whether members know, but James Bate is leaving us, unfortunately. I do want to acknowledge his contribution to the service. It's been very pleasurable working with him. I've certainly learnt a lot about conservation and heritage from him, more than I have any other conservation officer I've worked with. But the good news is we have replaced him, and we've got a replacement starting towards the end of September. But sad that he's leaving us, Chairman.
It is.
this question, but I would like to understand why it is, and I do sort of understand why it is that ward councillors cannot contribute to discussion on matters related to their ward, because you make your speech and then you hear the discussion and you know the issues, you know the matters that are going on. You know, you've trodden those streets delivering leaflets, and I understand the legal issues about conflict of interest, but I do not understand why that means we cannot contribute to this discussion.
It then goes back to the peer review we had, I don't know, a couple of years ago.
2017.
Yes.
February 2017.
Where we used, this policy was introduced as a result of a review that was carried out by, well, the peer review, who strongly advised us to follow this policy, because other authorities around the country do a similar thing, and there's probably more detailed reasons as to why that is, and it was a new experience for us, certainly. But yes, Councillor, but you felt you had opinions about it, didn't you, Councillor Jones?
Yeah, I mean, prior to that review, the ward member would sit here and talk to the item and would vote. Yeah. Yes. And after the review, it was felt that the ward member should not have a vote on the matter in their ward, which always seemed to me highly questionable. But it would be possible to draw a distinction between the ward member contributing to a discussion but not voting. So I'm just responding to the point you're making, which is that the ward member can often say, well, you know, there might be things of opinion, but there might be things of fact that the ward member is more aware of.
Councillor Stockman.
I think the peer review actually thought it disadvantaged those members who were not on this committee and so could not express and have a vote. Therefore, it was decided that it was better if we could speak, as they can, but not vote.
But that was the reason. It's possibly a debate for another place, but it would be cabinet. So raise it with the cabinet.
Chairman, just to add a bit more to Councillor Stockwood's explanation, it was, and I remember the report very well, effectively the, and I'll be open with the comments because it's in public domain, the peer review team witnessed, because they sat in on the planning committee, and they witnessed in their view what they considered to be parochialism, i.e. In certain circumstances they saw a ward councillor who had the benefit of speaking first under the procedures speak, and then before they heard the rest of the debate they would move a refusal, potentially contrary to the recommendation. That also demonstrates potentially a closed mind, and the view of the peer review team is that the planning committee should be operating strategically. Not to say it should only deal with strategic applications, but it should be operating on the basis of strategically borough-wide. And their concern was that by having the ward councillor voting on items, that was contrary to that approach. But yes, Chairman, if it's an issue that not to be dealt with in this arena, it would be Cabinet, I think, if there was any review of operational procedures for this committee. And ultimately,
Indeed, that was exactly. It would probably go to cabinet, and then have to be a policy change, and all the rest of it go to council, go to full council. Right. So thank you.
The peer review report is available if members want to.
Oh yes, yeah. There was the peer review report is in the system. It's there. It's 29 minutes past 8, so we'll close the meeting. Thank you very much for your input and cooperation, and see you in September, hopefully.